It's like ROGception. And that's right, I said ROG. Okay, it's the ROG Strix. And in my unboxing video, many comments were super upset that I called it the ROG Strix. Well, guys, it says ROG. ROG, R-O-G spells ROG. If you want to have an acronym that sounds like it can be pronounced as word, but you don't want people to pronounce it as word, too bad. The ROG Strix 3060. Now, can we just laugh at how big this cooler is for a 3060? But, I mean, it gets the job done, as you'll see in this video. Anyway, I wanted to test out some ray tracing and DLSS on this thing, and with Cyberpunk having a recent 1.5 update and being in a better state than it's ever been, figured we'd test it out in that game. I've got a ton of side-by-sides for you. I just spent like hours of my weekend benchmarking back to back, and we're gonna see ray tracing, we're gonna see DLSS, we're gonna see 1080p, 1440p, even 4K, and we can get just about to 4K 60 with some reasonable DLSS and image quality hits on this thing. Anyway, yeah, by the way, I'm running it at its stock settings, but its stock settings do have a small factory overclock, and we switched it over to the, where's the thing? There's a P mode and a Q mode. So P is the performance mode, Q is the quiet mode. Anyway, performance mode I think just runs the fans a little bit louder, but honestly I didn't hear much, and you'll see the temperatures in this were quite good. Let's go ahead and jump into the side-by-sides, and I'll tell you my thoughts. All right, the first thing we want to look at is 1080p, and we're going to look at the difference between ultra settings and high settings. And we are just running the built-in presets for the purposes of benchmarking here, so it's easier for the people at home to play along. And I've got to say that the subtle differences between ultra and high, well, are pretty subtle. I think we just saw some differences in the like volumetric fog that's going on inside that bar scene. I think we'll see a little bit of it here and in the lighting. If you look at, kind of the fog and the lighting here a little bit as we pass through this area, but it is, like I said, pretty subtle considering, I think I see it there around the dumpster, by the way. But in general, the performance difference here is massive between these. So this is definitely one of those games where playing on high instead of ultra could make a whole lot of sense. And when we see the final benchmark result here, you can see that while both of them average over 60 FPS, we can keep the minimums above 60 FPS by playing at the high preset. But let's go ahead and test out some ray tracing. If you kick on the RT medium preset in this game, it is pretty demanding, especially now. After the 1.5 patch, they actually updated the ray traced shadows to also be lighting sources other than just the sun. It used to just be the sun when the game launched. So this is actually more demanding than it used to be. So you can see that you can get a 30-ish FPS experience at native resolution, but running DLSS quality does get you to a much more playable situation, although definitely dipping below 60 FPS. This also doesn't include the ray-traced reflections. And if you look at some of the subtle details here, like the fencing, look at the palm trees in the distance, you can definitely tell that DLSS is on, and this is being upscaled from a lower resolution image. I find the palm trees here to be especially telling. There's a lot more shimmer going on in those palm tree branches as the camera pans when you're using DLSS. But the overall benchmark results here show that DLSS really does bring that performance up significantly. But what if we tried ray tracing at the ultra setting? Well, we already saw that DLSS was struggling even at the quality setting with RT medium. So I bumped it all the way down to DLSS balance. Now, look at the bottles in the bar. You can see them shimmering. Definitely not a full native 1080p here. Now, I know some of this is lost in YouTube compression. It's much more apparent in person when you're playing the game. There's nothing I can do about YouTube compression. Look at some of the other little details here. Some of the straight lines. Again, keep your eye out in the distance especially. Look at the fencing. Look at the stairs in the distance. They're very aliased using DLSS balanced. And as we come in here through the palm trees, I think that's going to be another place where the DLSS is very apparent. Although again, it does get you to playable frame rates with the ray tracing at ultra. So it's going to be up to you which trade-off makes the most sense to you. Still not going to be a locked 60 FPS, and I definitely wouldn't want to go below that. Now here we are with what if you just want the ray traced reflections? So this is everything else set to ultra, but then the only ray tracing turned on is the reflections, which is not one of the game's presets, but I think makes sense for a lot of people because the reflections tend to really pop as one of the more noticeable ray tracing settings in this game. Now, it's actually playable at native, but with DLSS quality, you can see that the frame rate here actually stays very high. And while once again, as I've pointed out before, especially looking in the distance here as we get outside, you will see some negative elements of the DLSS image, especially in the distance, like looking at those stairs. But the ray trace reflections really do pop, and DLSS quality doesn't look too horrible here, and it is getting the frame rate to be quite good. So you're basically playing the game maxed out plus really good reflections with a little bit of a trade-off on image quality here. And at 1080p, I honestly think if I was going to use ray tracing, this would probably be it, although I might actually just play the game at high with native. Now let's look at 1440p. So first, we're going to look at what do we get at native resolution with the ultra settings and the high settings. And as you can see, this bar scene, which is particularly demanding, there's a lot of, the fog here, there's a lot of character models on screen, a lot of lighting stuff going on. We're definitely well below 60, although the high settings at least would still feel fairly smooth, especially if you were on a variable refresh rate display. Now, as we get outside, some of these scenes aren't quite so demanding, but we're definitely not getting a nice 60 FPS experience in most scenes of this game at 1440p, even going down to high, and the ultra really seems to be pushing your luck a little beyond what the 3060 is going to be good for here. Now, again, the difference between ultra and high, like we saw at 1080p, is fairly small. So I think playing at the high setting instead of ultra, you're really not losing too much in the image. Feel free to pause the video, but it's hard to pick out the details. Much better average at the high settings. But what if we dropped it down to medium, or what if we kept it at ultra but went DLSS, and notice I'm going all the way down to balanced. I tried quality, but I felt like it still was pretty low in terms of frame rate. So I'm like, okay, our two options are turn down settings further to try to get to 60. That's why we're looking at the medium preset, or use a more aggressive DLSS. And that's why we're looking at ultra with DLSS balanced. And again, you can now take a look at the little details, especially as we get outside, and see if it makes sense to you. Now, if you're not on a 1440p screen, if you're on a 1080p screen watching the video, it'll be less apparent to you. Now, DLSS balanced, when you're running at 1440p, isn't quite as low res as DLSS balanced when you're running at 1080p, right? It has more to work with. So actually, it doesn't look too horrible, but again, especially in the palm tree branches and things, you certainly are losing something by going DLSS balanced. And honestly, the medium preset doesn't look too bad, really. Either way, you're getting pretty playable performance. But what if instead we drop down to those high settings, but then use DLSS quality instead of DLSS balanced? And that's what we're looking at here. And what's interesting to me here is whereas before the 1440p medium native was outperforming the ultra settings with DLSS balanced, now we're seeing the high settings with DLSS up to quality instead of balanced actually outperforming the native resolution at the medium preset. And so actually, I think that either of these settings make a lot of sense if you're playing at 1440p. It's just whether or not you notice the small differences between medium and high, more so than you notice the image artifacting, a little bit of ghosting, a little bit of aliasing, especially on the straight lines and things that we get from DLSS quality. Sorry, my kids are jumping around upstairs while I film this video. If you hear a bunch of thumping as they run and jump and things, I'm down here in the basement. Wow, they're noisy. Not usually that noisy while I'm filming a video. Anyway, now let's look at 4K just for the fun of it. So at 4K medium, we can roughly get a 30 FPS experience, but 30 FPS really isn't what I'm looking for. Although honestly, checking 4K on this card is really more just for fun. Although if you're willing to use DLSS, by going down to the balanced preset, we're actually getting fairly close to 60 FPS. It's definitely not going to be a 60 FPS average, although in scenes like the one here, we are jumping a bit above 60. It's, you know, gonna be pretty playable, especially if you're on a variable refresh rate display. Now, I know some people, you know, game on a 1080p or 1440p monitor, but also hook up to like a 4K TV and play at their couch sometimes. So that might be why somebody could be interested in this. I certainly wouldn't recommend buying a 3060 specifically for 4K gaming. Although games that do support DLSS can get you pretty good image quality and performance on a 4K screen. I hope all you have an excellent day.